remotely. Julio's both remote and in the room.
Yeah, we're
I don't know
live.
how you do that, but.
We're live.
Okay, our first witness is Nathaniel Earp from the Innocence Project, and welcome to Senate Judiciary. I'm going to ask the committee to go around the room and introduce themselves so that Nathaniel, starting with Senator Norris.
Good morning, Senator Bob Norris. I'm from Franklin 1.
Senator Tanya Vyhovsky, Chittenden Central.
Dick Sears, Bennington County.
Dr. Hashim, Whitman County.
And Phil Baruth, Chittenden Central.
We have a long history of working with the Innocence Project here in the Vermont Senate Judiciary Committee. And some of our efforts were some of the testimony and some of the issues were some of those that I remember the most. Probably working with Rebecca Brown on the false identification through lineups that had to do with the picking cotton. It's one of those that I'll never forget the testimony. It was riveting. So welcome, Nathaniel, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about an act relating to custodial interrogation of juveniles.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, members of the committee. For the record, my name is Nathaniel Erb. I'm a state policy advocate with the Innocence Project. We're a New York-based national organization that represents persons who've been wrongfully convicted. And I serve on the policy team where we take what we've learned from cases of wrongful convictions across the country and turn that into reforms that deal with how to prevent the causes of wrongful convictions, how to make sure the doors are open to revealing those convictions to the court system and overcoming the issue of proving innocence, and then helping exonerees on the back end. So by way of this issue this morning, the Innocence Project has had a long history of working on false confessions through looking just at exonerations that are based on DNA evidence. So that means some level of DNA evidence was used in the exoneration process. Over 30% of those exonerations have involved a false confession. In homicide cases of DNA exonerations, it's actually the most common factor when we look at causes of confessions, whether it be mistaken eyewitness identifications, false confessions, issues in forensic sciences, perjury, or other ethics issues within the representatives of the court or of the state. False confessions are the most common factor across all cases of DNA exonerations. When you go beyond that and you look at all cases of exoneration, so all cases where someone has been proven innocence and there's affirmative proof of innocence, but that may have been through overcoming an issue of forensic science. It may have been of overcoming an issue of false witness testimony, or there was no other, or there a lack of proof of guilt because other evidence had fallen to the wayside. Those almost 4,000 cases, over 397 of those cases involved false confessions, and over 267 of those, almost 400 cases, were of persons 25 years of age or younger. So as we've been looking at this issue, our first step was how do we reveal these issues as they come to light? So our major piece of legislation, as the state has worked on, has been on recording interrogation. So we can know what's going on in the interrogation room. Officers themselves can review the interrogation to catch any issues that might have happened. And then the court system has a process of review. But the problem we've had is even when there are instances of recorded interrogations, and particularly when there's no recording of the interrogation, you find that there are still these 400 cases of false confessions that have come into the courtroom. And when you review these issues of false confessions, you look throughout a really horrendous list of casework where you have a false confession. You often have very limited corroborating evidence. You often have contradictory evidence to the statement. And then you have these various interrogation tactics that are covered by S6 that are often involved in them, whether that's lying to the suspect about the evidence, whether that's lying to them about leniency, whether that's using withholding food, interrogating the person for tens, if not 60 and hundreds of hours over repeated times, threatening to incarcerate another person if they don't cooperate, threatening to take away their kids, all these various different factors that law enforcement has largely moved away from. But our question has been, Well, what happened in the breakdown? When the court knew of these cases, they knew of these factors that occurred. Why were these false confessions still allowed in? Why did they overcome these proven innocent evidence of innocence? Why did it overcome other factors that the court had weighed and still determined voluntary? So that's what's led us into this last level of work, most recently, which has been around the issues of interrogation tactics themselves. We've focused primarily on the issue of deception as being a major piece of interrogation tactics that law enforcement groups across the country and internationally have called for the end of, particularly against children, because we see that so prevalent in issues of false confessions. And we also know that the way the court system has treated the due process analysis and the voluntary analysis of confessions, those tactics do not necessarily rise to the level of coercion. But the courts themselves have said that it is the duty of the states to enact legislation to address how do we determine whether or not a confession is reliable, because the voluntariness standards only assesses whether or not something is coerced. It does not necessarily mean a non-coerced confession is going to be voluntary. In fact, in one of the cases around this issue, Illinois v. Perkins, I'm sure many members of the committee will be fully aware of the concept of Perkins informants. Supreme Court Justice Brennan wrote that deliberate use of deception and manipulation by law enforcement appears to be incompatible with a system that presumes innocence and assures that a conviction will not be secured by inquisitorial means. So when it leads to legislation itself, what we've looked at is there's this factor that's missing from the process. Well, first and foremost, if we want to move to a place where we completely ban these tactics, where if there's evidence of deception being used or any of these other tactics that are considered within S6, one policy proposal is to just simply ban those tactics. So if there's evidence they've been used, then the confession or any statement derived from the use of those tactics or an interrogation when those tactics were used, that is automatically thrown out. That's just a writ large deterrent. There are now 5 states that have passed legislation along this route. Utah is actually the strongest, and they've taken that route. I've submitted to the committee a breakdown of all the laws across the country. Utah doesn't have within their text of their code what happens when the statute is violated, but it's governed by a rule of evidence that requires strict adherence to the statute. So that would say the state has to prove by preponderance of evidence that they adhered to the statute, and the statute just directly says you cannot use false facts or lies about leniency that might induce a false confession. So the question was then, if we do not take that strict route, what is the analysis we want to inject in the system so that there is at least an extra level of scrutiny to specific tactics through policy that we call attention to, like deception, and like those tactics listed in the psychologically manipulative section? What is that extra analysis? So from us as an organization largely focused around forensic science and DNA from the first standpoint, the concept of reliability was an obvious choice. So as S6 covers in the bill, the requirement of the state to prove that even if any of these tactics were used and the state statute was violated, the state has to demonstrate that there's a reliableness in addition to the voluntariness underlying the confession. So most of the states have kind of pursued that route as kind of a middle ground. California is being the only one that didn't prescriptively put language about how the violation of the statute will be dealt with, but that's where we've moved towards, is saying, for the most part, these tactics aren't used already. If in the rare circumstances in which they are used, and the state and the defense is able to prove that they are used, likely through a recorded interrogation, then it's on the court to weigh whether or not the use of these tactics overrode voluntariness and undermine the reliability of the statement. Reliability being a factor that's considered within how to judge the expertise of scientific witnesses, how to judge the value of forensic science, and it is a concept that is discussed by the U.S. Supreme Court as they've been weighing these cases of how far does due process go in protecting against this issue. And in Colorado v. Connolly, one of those cases, they specifically called out that it is the duty of the legislature, or the fora, to assess that issue. So as the laws have progressed so far, it is all progress and part of compromise of working with all of our partners. We've been glad that each of the laws that have been passed in the states has had some level of law enforcement support. In some states like Utah, where we've had every single agency and entity of law enforcement and prosecution supporting the bill ultimately. But that's the path that we've led us down, is injecting that test and concept of reliability into the weighing of the courts, but leaving it up to the courts to determine what are the levels, what are the measures of reliability. Things that we often talk about within the legislative record would be, does the evidence contradict any of the, does the statement contradict any of the other evidence? Is there corroborating evidence that goes to the root of the confession? Was the meat of the confession those key factors, like where the bloody knife was, where the car was left? Was that information that was offered by the suspect, or was that entirely information of the police officers themselves interjected into the conversation, saying, we know you did this, this, and this, and then the sum total of the confession is just those factors? In the first 70 or so false confession cases with DNA evidence, almost all those cases involved clearly the evidence that was made up the sum total of the false confession came from what was offered by the law enforcement officers and unintentionally in the course of the interrogation. So we haven't prescriptively so far in any state statute added in a list of these have to be the 5 or 7 factors that the court weighs, because we think the court can determine that, and we don't want to handhold a little too much. But those are the things that we've talked about as the way to go about this. One other piece to the bill itself is cabin to custodial interrogations. This has been the choice of states so far because it's incumbent on the concept of the bill that you have to have proof of violation occurring. So as we've been looking at states to work in, we've focused just on states that have a recording mechanism, and recording of interrogations is almost entirely cabin to a custodial interrogation. So the idea being is, in order to really assess whether or not deception has been used or these other tactics have been used and the statute has been violated, there has to be recorded interrogation so the defense could review it and the defense could make the motion based off of the violation because they can see it in the recorded interrogation. One other topic that came up last in the hearing that I listened to yesterday was the concept of Vermont has already taken a step forward to including parents or interested adults, I believe the state calls it, in the interrogation room. I submitted this morning a study that the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers has just released. It's been the position of the Innocence Project that while we don't oppose legislation around inclusion of interested adults, it's legislation that we don't actively support, because we've heard from our colleagues in the space, as well as now through studies like this, where the inclusion of interested adults can actually be detrimental to the process of protecting rights, because the adults themselves can have contrary interests to the child. Adults themselves do not understand Miranda most often, and they themselves, I think in the study it pointed out that 60% of the adults surveyed didn't know themselves that deception was a concept that was allowed in interrogation, that law enforcement could be lying to their child that they're trying to protect, and they themselves are susceptible to those same tactics. So we're worried that because the standards of assessing voluntariness and the inability to really ensure that the confessions are reliable, even if you have these protections of recorded interrogation or an adult in the interrogation room, that can be seen as a false panacea and a false sense of security that really becomes a checkbox for the confession being viewed as voluntary, because how could it be involuntary? How could it be unreliable if an adult was in the room, if a well-trained officer was in a room, if it was recorded? Because what we see in our case is that the false confessions across the country are not just made, and almost systematically not made, by officers trying to put someone who didn't commit a crime in jail. It's by mistakes being made, things being missed, issues being caused throughout the system. There are those cases of malicious actors in our cases, but it's the need for those checks and balances when the system just doesn't function wholesale. So some of the other things that I wanted to raise was, I know Vermont has not yet had a case of a false confession, but I wanted to encourage you to take action nonetheless. Oregon, Utah, and Delaware, which have each acted on this issue, did not have any cases of false confessions of juveniles. You're going to hear shortly from Christopher Tapp, who's an exoneree from Idaho. Mr. Tapp's case was the first case of false confession in Idaho that was and his case involved deception and the use of these types of tactics. His case wasn't revealed until 2019, and he was convicted in the 1990s. So while I hope it's not the case, it is very likely possible that there could be someone currently sitting in prison in Vermont that has not had their case come to light, that there is a false confession case, or that could happen. So within the text of the bill itself. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question before we go on. How would you define psychologically manipulative interrogation tactics? That one seemed to stumble us yesterday to some extent. What exactly do we mean? What's intended there?
So the way I read the bill, so it comes from the language used in the California bill that was enacted last year, and as the way I read the bill and the way the discussions happen on that bill is it's largely a stylistic method where it's not intended as a new term of art for the courts to expound upon and add more value to. That's certainly possible that the courts could rule in that way, but more so as a way for within the text of the bill to not constantly repeat all the factors that we're talking about, where we talk about deception means X, Y, and Z, psychological manipulative tactics mean X, Y, and Z, and that in such that the concept of psychologically manipulative tactics could be replaced with another term, and that term just means that it's these 5 types of factors that we're talking about. And that's same with like the concept. Deception makes sense for what we're talking about in that context, but in a way within this text of the statute, that could be replaced with another word as long as that word is defined by how it's defined in the bill. So if the concept of psychologically manipulative tactics is too broad or potentially could open the door to things that are not intended to be contemplated by the statute, one suggestion that we would support is perhaps clarifying the bill that it is limited to these factors, or coming up with another term that captures those factors beyond deception that we want courts to review. Largely, we think about it, the concept in terms of what are tactics that are used to try and push someone to say something that you think they're guilty of and you want them to say. And that's largely how it kind of came about in California, was just what's a good way to kind of capture those 5 or 6 factors rather than trying to list them out each time in the bill, which is not really an answer to your question, I don't think, but that's what
I'm still having a hard time figuring it out. We'll come back to that during markup, I guess, but.
So I know that we had some conversation yesterday, or I don't think it was yesterday, but the last time we looked at this bill around adults in the room. And I hear you say that, that interested adult is not necessarily the best practice. And I'm wondering if it might be better to have a requirement of the presence of a juvenile attorney for juvenile interrogations. And I think I heard someone testify that there is another state that does that.
Yeah, that certainly is so I would say on the adults piece, it's not something we oppose. It's not something we pursue because we as a policy decision support the inclusion and requirement of an attorney if the state can afford to do so. That has been a limiting factor in other states, but we've certainly supported legislation. Last year, Maryland passed legislation to require the presence of an attorney in an adult interrogation, which we advocated for and supported. It still presents the issue that for the circumstances where that breaks down, where there is an attorney available, or for some reason that the child still says something and confesses something that they did not commit, does the court have the tools to review that properly, and will it still allow unreliable confessions in, because the court itself is not examining these factors of deception in the way that we would want them to.
Oh, certainly I wasn't suggesting instead of, but more as an augmentation to, with hopefully an understanding that a juvenile trained attorney would be better able to navigate if these types of tactics were coming up and hopefully not be as susceptible to them.
It's certainly something we support. I wouldn't want to get out in front of any of the public defender service in Vermont and making sure that they have the resources necessary to accomplish that task, but it's something that we've supported other legislatures in accomplishing alongside the defenders in their
Like
state.
a lot of questions, we're suffering from a lack of personnel. So,
Definitely.
you know, we don't have enough lawyers, believe it or not.
That's been, I know colleagues that colleagues that I worked with on the deception legislation in Delaware last year that passed, dealing with a similar issue where it is a goal that the agency wants to accomplish, but it's just a matter of resourcing, that they just do not have enough attorneys right now to be able to accomplish the room when in a timely manner for when an officer would need to interrogate a juvenile.
Yes. Hi, Nathaniel. You had commented that there was 5 states that have looked at something that's very similar to this bill and have passed this particular or some version of this law.
Yes, Senator.
Do you have any knowledge or of states who have actually looked at this and have turned this down?
So there are a number of other states that are in the process. So last year, Connecticut passed legislation for Senate, but they ran out of time in a short session. Florida also passed legislation through one committee, but it didn't make it through the other committees in time. Washington State is currently reintroduced legislation they worked on last year that's covering adults. Colorado as well has passed legislation through one chamber last session, and they're reintroducing legislation again. They just reintroduced it. And then there are a number of other states that are currently working. Nevada is going to be reintroducing legislation in line with Utah's law that will be considered this session. So, I mean, in the process, of course, some bills did not pass in 1 year, which is often the want of legislation. So, but there's no state that I've worked on this issue that I've seen that has resoundingly turned down the bill in terms of no leading members wanted to sponsor it or work on it. It's just a matter of time of working it through the legislature.
You had some other points when I interrupted you.
Oh, not a problem. Yeah, I just wanted to touch on, I think one of the questions was on the concept within deception of knowing communication of facts. I read that language, and it could be clarified, and it has been the intent in other statutes that the use of deception, whether it's lying about evidence, whether it's misrepresenting facts, whether it's misrepresenting the law or misrepresenting promises of leniency, has been that the officer would have a knowing intent behind that. Unfortunately, it's still not going to capture scenarios where the officer is unintentionally doing so and the child still falsely confesses. But that has been a middle ground that we worked on with law enforcement in other states of that we didn't want to catch anyone in a catch-22 where there was an intention, where the officer may not have known that the fact was false for some reason, and that the confession would be thrown out because there wasn't that knowledge component behind it. And that also requiring that knowing intent. So to some of the frustration of my friends in the defense community, does create an extra burden in the process on bringing an action in this regard, where the defense would be able to demonstrate that there is a knowing intent, or there should have been a knowing, and it's clear that there would have been knowledge that this information was false. And within that, the other question I think came up around unauthorized. That's another term of art through discussions with members of law enforcement, and particularly prosecution in other states, where that comes from the first bill that was passed in Illinois, though Oregon, I think, beat them by signing by a day. So I don't want to take their win away from them. But the idea behind that was originally it was false promises of leniency. But the question was, law enforcement officers do not, as a matter of practice, make promises of leniency. It is up to district attorneys to determine what is the offer of leniency. And so the issue we were tackling was, if an officer is saying or inferring or telling a juvenile that they will get a deal, that they'll go home tonight, that they will not be prosecuted for the murder they're being interrogated for X, Y, and Z, that would be in violation if a district attorney has not already authorized that promise of leniency. It was that was the way to get around that made the district attorneys in Illinois more comfortable about how to cabin that. But there could be another term in Vermont that gets at that issue, but that's the origin of the concept of the unauthorized promise of leniency versus a false promise.
Yes.
Can I just ask a question about the concept of knowing? Is that the individual officer doing the interrogation or anyone? Because I certainly could imagine a circumstance where we just don't tell the interrogating officer because then they didn't know, but somebody knew.
Yeah, that is the issue. as it's been discussed in other states, it has always been along the concept of a knowing intent by the officer that it was the person or the agent of the officer, whoever's doing the interrogation on behalf of the law enforcement entity, it is authorized to do the interrogation. That person would had to know that they are misleading the juvenile or lying X, Y, and Z. That the knowing intent would be that person who is providing information, because that's the person you're also being conversation you're examining. It does, as you rightly point out, and as I also mentioned, by just cabining it to knowing, open up opportunities where you're still allowing false confessions to potentially not be examined in the way that they should be, because the person didn't know or it was withheld in some way. Hopefully that wouldn't be the case, and knowing and hearing of the work that especially the Vermont State Police has done around training on interrogations, that's not going to be an issue in Vermont. But I think that is a potentiality. Hopefully won't come to light, but could happen.
Any other comments, questions? Thank you so much.
Absolutely. And I've also submitted testimony, I forgot to mention, from Wicklander Zalowski, which is I think Mr. Thompson mentioned yesterday, one of the largest trainers of law enforcement interrogators in the country. They weren't able to come testify this morning, but they wanted to make sure that they submitted testimony and would be available if the committee asks comments for them. They chose to discontinue teaching deceptive interrogation tactics as far back as 2017. So they even beat my office to the punch. But they've actively supported this, and because there are other interrogation methods, particularly in contrast to deception, that they advocate for, which are fact-based. And so they submitted testimony and support and be available as experts. And I think following me is Christopher Tapp from Idaho. And so thank you so much for your considering of this, and our office is available.
And I hope you'll stand by.
Absolutely.
Next week, we'll take the bill up again for markup, and we appreciate if you're able to join us at that time.
Yep, absolutely.
Maybe answer some questions and offer some advice. Christopher Tapp is next. Christopher, welcome to Senate Judiciary. You're somewhere, not here in Vermont, I don't think, but somewhere in Idaho. You're from Idaho.
Yes, sir, I am. I thank you guys for having me today and let me be able to testify in front of you guys.
Thank you for joining us.
I love this work. I love being able to have a chance to talk to you guys about what is wrong with the system. I mean, the system is broken certain things, and I like being able to have the chance to talk to you guys of what's wrong with the system and try to change it for the next individual that comes behind me. Doesn't have to go through some of the things that I had to go through for 20 years, 53 days of, sitting behind, the walls and not having a voice. So I like being able to have a voice for the voiceless right now, and trying to help the next individual that comes home, and try to make it better for the next individual, for they don't have to go through the same things that I had to sit through for half my life. So, hello, my name is Christopher Tapp. I want to thank Senator Sears for sponsoring this legislation and all the members of the committee for considering this important bill today. I'm here to testify as an exonerated person with personal and professional experience with deceptive interrogations. In 1998, I was wrongfully found guilty of rape and murder in Idaho that I did not commit, and falsely confessed to the crime because of pressure detectives used to extract what they wanted to hear. I falsely confessed after being subjected to harsh and deceptive interrogation tactics by police officers. So what do I mean by that? The officers, the lead detective that coerced the false confession out of me, he used the relationship I had with him. He was my junior high and high school resource officer. So I built a relationship with this man over, let's say the 8 or 10 years that I, from junior high, high school. So from the age of 13 till the age of 20. So 7 years that I built a relationship. So what he used was a friendship. And then during the interrogations, over 60 some hours of being interrogated and seven sham polygraphs, they built a confession. So 6 different stories. I went in. The first story I told him I had no knowledge of this murder. I had no idea about this murder. Was the first story till the 6th story, where I said I helped in the murder, I helped the victim down, and that was what convicted me and sent me to prison of first-degree murder and rape, and I was sentenced to 30 years to life in prison, and it was all by hypotheticals. He would use hypotheticals. Hey, hypothetically, if he was there, and I would tell him during the interrogations, I wasn't there, but hypothetically, if you were, and then he would use, like during the time of 1996 with the O.J. Simpson, and so in 1997, when I was first arrested and charged in going through all this interrogation, he would be like, hey, it was like the O.J. Simpson murder. And that's how the crime was she was brutally raped and murdered. And so he would use tactics like that during the time. So, and they would give me false information, or they would give me information of the crime throughout all of this. And then during the time I was 20 years old, so I'd go out and smoke cigarettes. So when I would go out and smoke cigarettes, they would give me more information about the crime when we were off videotape. And then they would go back in, and then they would give me, and then I would repeat what they gave me at cigarette breaks or during the polygraphs. And so that's how this whole entire, from story 1 to story 6, that's how it all transpired. Was I was fed information through all of this. They lied to me, they threatened me with the death penalty, and fed me details about this crime in order to coerce a believable confession. This bill will help address this issue of feeding details. And I know you know all this, but that's how a lot of these false and forced confessions come. Is they promise leniency. They promise you a lot of things. They promise you they won't send you to prison, or hey, you help us, we'll help you. And that's what they did to me, was they promised me leniency. They promised me if I helped testify against a friend of mine during all this, that they wasn't going to send me to prison. So, they promised me a lot of things, and then they tore up the agreement. The day that I was finally, arrested, January 28th of 1997 was the last day that I was free, is because of all the lies that the police department said that I gave to them, which they fed to me, was the last day that I was free, because all the lies that I fed to them were untrue, but they said I lied to them. So that's why they tore up my agreement. That during all this time, the police department could have stopped doing what they did, but they never did. They just continued on with the story that they believed, which was true. And all this time, they could have stopped it. DNA was never DNA cleared me back, during all this. DNA was part of this case, and DNA cleared me, and they never stopped, because they truly believed that I was part of this crime, or they believed one of my friends was part of this crime. And they were so tunnel visioned on him that they continued on with this concept. It was me, him, and some mystery guy that I didn't know the name. So they were so set on this idea. And so they continued on giving me story after story until, like I said, 6 different versions of this confession, until finally it was enough to get a conviction. My confession and much more, and much of my interview was even taped. At trial, my attorney tried to unsuccessfully suppress my clearly coerced confession, but the judge said they were voluntary and still could be used against me. Even judges make mistakes. Even a judge could have stopped this, but they didn't. Like many other exonerees in my position, there was no physical evidence connecting me to this crime. Further, the clear proof of my false confession didn't even set me free. While the state had no evidence, I had to have DNA evidence to prove my innocence. My case is clearly that on guilt until proven innocent. In learning of other cases of exonerees in my position, it's clear that deceptive and these interrogation techniques focus on proving that person is guilty rather than finding the truth. I know some cases where exonerees falsely confess and get out of the room because law enforcement lied and told them that they had DNA. They believed that after the DNA was tested, they would be set free, but later found out that there wasn't any DNA to prove their innocence, and that they falsely confessed and was used to take their freedom. I spent nearly half my life in prison for a crime I did not commit, while the real perpetrator remained free. That's 20 years and 53 days in prison while the real perpetrator walks free. While that happens, it's worse than an unsolved crime, because no one is even looking for them, and they knew that they could get away with it. And that's completely true. I am the first familiar. I am CC Moore. I am the first genealogical exoneration in the country. So I am the first. They CC Moore from Parabon. They used familial DNA. They found the last name, and she was able to track the actual perpetrator who lived across the street from the victim, and found from genealogical DNA. So they found the family's last name, and she went through the family tree and was able to find the true killer that lives across the street. And he disappeared from town 2 weeks after the murder. Before my case, Idaho was like Vermont. There was no false confession has been uncovered before I was wrongly convicted. And even after that, Idaho thought it was no false confession case for another 20 years until I was exonerated. You should not wait for someone to lose their freedom and a horrible crime to go unsolved before you act. I am glad to be able to be here before you today and speak on behalf of innocent people in Vermont who hopefully will never have to be in my place because you are acting proactively. I encourage you to act to protect him and also to take another stance as a state on what policing should be and set an example for states like mine and the rest of the country. I thank you for your time and urge you to pass this bill.
Thank you, Christopher. It's very difficult to hear your story and not have great empathy. I'm curious, given your relationship with the officer who was interrogating you, do you think he cared whether you did it or not? I mean, was he honestly believing that you did it, this was okay, or it just, did he use that relationship to manipulate you?
I really think he used that relationship to manipulate me. Still to this day, I've settled my case with the city of Idaho Falls. You know, I had asked for an apology. Part of the settlement agreement that I asked from the city, you know, I received, you know, the monetary amount, but part of the settlement agreement is I still had to ask for an apology. So when you know, we did the settlement, you know, when we were doing the settlement agreement, I still had to ask the city of Idaho Falls to give me the apology. They weren't going to give me an apology. So I still asked the city to give me an apology, and that's how I received an apology. I was never going to receive an apology. And to answer one of the questions that was asked earlier about who knew, you know, you guys were asking earlier to Nathaniel about, you know, who's in, like for the police, who knows and who will get in trouble. Like the chief of police came to I was living with my mother at the time. You know, I was 20 years old. I was, you know, recovering drug addict. I was trying to get my life in order and stuff like that. My mom told me I wasn't going back for an interrogation. So they sent out an arrest warrant. The chief of police came to my mother's house where I was living and told my mom I need to come back in. So everybody knew from the bottom of the food chain to the detectives that were, you know, involved in this interrogations and to the chief of police. So everybody knew who you know, everybody in the food chain was involved in this crime against me. And that's the only way I can ever explain it. It's a crime against me because they stole over 20 years of my life, half of my life at that time. I've been home for in March, I've been home for 6 years. You know, it took another 2 years to be fully exonerated. But so everybody in a little bit was involved in this crime. So I don't know. I believe truly and wholeheartedly he took advantage of that relationship. I had faith and belief in the police department. I had true hope and belief in that officer, and that they would never lie to me or to any individual, because my parents brought me up, right, that the police would never lie to a suspect or they would never lie to a citizen, and which was completely untruthful, and that stole all that. So again, I'm grateful that I was able to open the eyes of the public here in the state of Idaho, that it shows that the police department does lie to suspects. So again, and then also some of the training the police department, you know, receives, the read technique, you know, for that 85% of the time when police use the read technique, that forces a false confession. So that needs to be changed, you know, in part of what happens, you know, in police training. That has to be changed. I mean, so there's a lot of things that need to be changed and you know, in the system. I'm just not saying, you know, it's all on the police department, because again, people shouldn't be committing crimes either. I mean, people shouldn't be committing murders or anything else to that effect. So a lot needs to be changed in the system, but also the police are supposed to be held to a higher standard than a normal citizen also. They're the ones who are supposed to be protecting us as citizens, not we're supposed to be protecting ourselves from them either, if that makes sense.
It does, and I really appreciate your coming forward. Also, yesterday, we heard testimony that, you know, Vermont is different. We're a rural state, people know each other. And your testimony, to some extent, counteracts that rural state people know each other, since you knew the police officer who was doing the interrogation for 7 years. Yeah, I'm sorry.
No worries. Thank you so much for being here. My question, I think, is actually for legislative counsel in response to your testimony. And that is in the bill as it's written, that says involved in questioning by a law enforcement officer. Would that cover questioning by a school resource officer?
If they're certified as a law enforcement officer.
But if they're not, like I know Essex has moved away from using certified law enforcement in that role and is instead using a retired law enforcement officer, would that not then cover them?
No.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions for Christopher? Thanks for making yourself available. We really appreciate it. You can stay tuned next week and view us if you'd like when we take it up. Be happy to have you join us again. And if you think of anything that you didn't think of today, I always make my best speeches on the way home after I do one. So feel free.
For me, it's on the dog walk in the woods.
Yeah.
Just me and the dog.
Yeah. Talking with the dog helps.
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
I wish I had said that, you know.
And again, I thank you guys so much time for, you know, for letting me be able to speak. And I thank you guys for considering this bill, because you don't know how much it means for other individuals that have been wrongfully convicted, you know, inside your state and other states across, you know, the United States, that, you know, your state is taking it proactively. Because again, it gives us the momentum to move it to another state. Does that make sense?
You know, and the point you made earlier is a good one. And getting the wrong person means that the person who actually committed the crime is still out there.
It does. And like I said, it took, and I feel bad for the victim's family. You know, the Dodge family, that, you know, I speak highly of the Dodge family, because the victim's family, the mother, she became an advocate for my release after 10 years of being incarcerated. So I was arrested in 1997, in 2010. So we're looking at what, 13 years later, the victim's family started asking for my release, because she watched the polygraphs. She started the interrogations. She saw the wrongness of the interrogations, and she saw what was wrong. So she started becoming an advocate for my release. She started to believe in my innocence. So she started to taking up the banner for asking for my release. So again, it was a whole entire different world when the victim's family started asking for my release. So it's different, you know what I mean? It was a different world for me. And I tell people I'm lucky, you know, in that accord, but I don't know how much luck has to do with it.
Our next
But again,
Julio Thompson, to continue. Julio, we almost seem to always run up against the clock here for you, and this is a bad habit for us to be in, so. But hopefully, I know you've got quite a bit on the webpage.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm Julio Thompson. I'm an Assistant Attorney General and Director of the Civil Rights Unit. As I briefly mentioned yesterday to the committee, I've, in addition to my work in doing my job as a Civil Rights Unit Director since 1991, I've been involved in the areas of modernization of policing, on a variety of subjects, including use of force, including stop searches, arrests, and interviews. One of the projects I've been working on since 2014 is initially the DOJ investigation and later consent decree involving the Baltimore Police Department. And I personally worked on a number of policy reforms for that agency, including very detailed policies regarding custodial interrogation and interrogation of minors, or in a separate policy specifically addressing special precautions to be taken for youthful suspects. And I've uploaded some of those materials there. I want to start off, there's a lot to cover here, and we've heard really great testimony here. I want to start off maybe by continuing to dispel some misimpressions that folks have about how these things come about. It's a misconception to believe that false confessions come primarily from people who think they have the wrong guy, but want to convict the guy anyway. Typically, the facts that emerge in these cases are law enforcement think they have the right person. And there is the most commonly taught investigative interview and interrogation technique is a two-stage process. That's a Reed method we talk about. It's named after John Reed, who used to be a polygraph examiner for the Chicago Police Department in the 1960s. He's not a social scientist, he's a polygraph expert. The Reed method was mentioned in Miranda versus Arizona as a coercive interrogation technique that necessitated the Miranda warning. The court noted that police had moved from the early parts of our country from physical coercion to psychological manipulation and coercion, referred to the Reed method, which is still taught today, still taught in Vermont. And so the problem, it can happen with very, very skilled individuals. And last year when the government oversight committees were looking at this, I talked about a case, and this is a case I sometimes mention when I do training for law enforcement officials about confirmation bias and the precautions they need to take. It's a case that arises out of the Second Circuit. Our circuit arose out of New York. It's a case involving a student, a college student named Abdallah Higazi. Now, after the 9/11 attacks, there were a number of hotels that were near the World Trade Center that were evacuated because it was unclear how much damage had been done to the building. And so the Millennium Hotel, which was a few blocks away from the World Trade Center, was evacuated immediately. And after they determined the building was safe, they had security personnel go in and basically collect the inventory for all of the rooms that had been evacuated. And Abdallah Higazi was one of those people. He was an Egyptian student. He was here on scholarship, was going to study in New York City, and he was housed temporarily in the Millennium. During the inventory, one of the security guards reported to the front desk that they found in Higazi's room, in the safe, that they found a gold medallion, a copy of the Quran, and a radio, a transponder radio. It's a sort of radio that pilots use. It's not something you buy at Radio Shack. And so they reported that, and they reported it to the FBI, which had sent some of its best people to find out if there were other people on the ground who were conspiring with the hijackers. And a pet theory at the time, I don't mean to diminish it, but a hypothesis they were trying to work out is whether there were people on the ground who used communications material to help steer the jets into the towers. And one of the theories was that there might be people on the ground doing that. And now they had a report that an Egyptian student who was not studying aviation had an aviation radio that he really shouldn't have. So they brought him in for questioning in December of 2001 and asked him how he got the radio. He said he didn't recognize what the radio was, and they continued to tell him, well, we know you're not telling the truth. And they used various means of persuading him to keep talking and admit that the radio was his. They suggested, they didn't directly threaten, they suggested he might be deported. They suggested that things might go badly for his family if Egypt, if it came out that he was viewed as being someone who was resisting an investigation. Higazi later testified that he was well aware, and he assumed the FBI and the investigators were aware that the security police in Egypt don't follow American constitutional law. So he viewed that as a direct to his family's safety. Eventually, they got him to provide three different accounts of what happened. The first time he said that he found the radio in a subway near City Hall. Later, they pressed him, so that wasn't satisfactory. He said he found it under the Brooklyn Bridge. He later said he had stolen it from the Egyptian airport. And so at that point, the FBI filled out an affidavit saying, we want to keep him in custody now because he's told us 3 stories. Not all 3 can be true. And so they had an affidavit of probable cause that he's lied to the FBI, which is a federal crime. So he was detained for a month and questioned again by a polygraph examiner who did use some misrepresentations. At one point, Higazi apparently, according to the court which handled the case, the civil lawsuit that came later, he had something resembling a panic attack and said that the leads on his arm were hurting and he wanted them removed. The polygraph examiner said he was acting like a baby, that this doesn't cause pain to 9-year-old children wouldn't complain about these leads that are glued to his arm. And he further stated that in all his years as a polygraph examiner, he'd never heard a person who was telling the truth complain of pain. So Higazi again continued to provide statements that weren't true. He later said it was a way to try to please the examiner so that he could be released and resume his studies. Roughly a month into his custody and his continued examination, an individual showed up at the hotel asking for his property. It was a U.S. Airlines pilot. One of the things he asked for was his aviation radio. And he described it in a manner that matched the radio that was seized by the security guards. The FBI went back to the security guard who then presented a slightly different story about how it came. Ultimately, he admitted that the radio was found on the floor above Higazi's apartment, or his room. It was a room occupied by the airline pilot. So the person who was providing false information to begin with was the security guard who was later charged and convicted for lying at the FBI. There was a civil lawsuit that resulted, as you might imagine, it resulted in a substantial settlement to Mr. Higazi. The U.S. DOJ officer, Inspector General, upon prompting from the federal judge who oversaw the case, did a top-down examination and just found that these were investigators, highly trained investigators who really believed they had someone there and used every method at their disposal to try to get them. And one of their initial methods was to try to generate two incompatible stories so that you can keep someone in custody on the grounds that at least one of them is false. So the point here, and this is something that it's a case I often, when I'm doing training, I talk about this in the area of confirmation bias, where people focus on an explanation and then don't focus on alternate incompatible sources of explanation. So as it turned out in that case, the FBI, once they had Higazi willing to talk to them initially, they never bothered to check the guest register to find out if there were any airline pilots in the hotel. Had they done so, maybe all of this wouldn't have happened. So the larger point I just want to start with is that this can happen to the best, most highly motivated people. Those FBI professionals clearly wanted to find out if there was a broader conspiracy. Everyone wanted them to do so. And yet, because they used certain techniques, they generated predictably bad results. Yes.
How old was Mr. Higazi?
He was 20 at the time. There's been some discussion, and I'm perhaps not the right witness to bring it up in terms of social science, but the U.S. Supreme Court has recognized in a number of cases that there are limitations on brain development up to about age 25. And those cases are based on expert testimony. There's quite a bit of literature out there, and I didn't provide any of that. I think if you want to hear that kind of testimony, there are other professionals I think that are available in the state.
The Justice Lab at Columbia University worked with us on Raise the Age, and that was a lot of the testimony that we're able to certainly look at that if we consider going above 18 for an age limit here.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's.
I know my eyes are watering for some unknown reason, and I don't know why.
Yeah, how these things work out in the different states, I think it's just a matter of some of it's compromise or.
But you're correct. The evidence was that at 25, although some 50-year-olds are much more immature than many 20-year-olds I've met over the years. But
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, there are a number of
seeing
cases.
at 25 is when the decisions are made.
Yeah, and I can provide citations later on. I mean, there's a case, there's a 2012
But
case.
unfortunately,
We're out of time.
we are against
Okay.
the noontime.
So let me just point out, I'll just get to how our office views this. We support legislation that would prohibit deception and custodial interrogations of youthful offenders. And if there's an opportunity to address other manipulative tactics that are used that are likely, reasonably likely to be expected to generate unreliable statements, whether they're confessions or not, is something that we would support as well. We recognize that there are issues about narrowing the language. I just want to briefly outline or throw out here another consideration that it may or may not be feasible in your view, but because there are so many different ways that individuals can be manipulated, from things like shackling them to the table, having more than 2 officers in the room, denial of breaks. One approach might be to consider, in addition to a general prohibition on deception, is charging criminal justice counsel to develop a model policy for developing real guide rails with a lot of input about the appropriate manner of conducting custodial interrogations in general, and for if you want to be limited to minors. The Baltimore policy, which I've provided you a copy of, there's, I think, a 14-page policy on custodial interrogations generally, which include things like you shall not fabricate evidence, create a fake form that say this is a lab report. That was a real problem in Baltimore, and so they specifically addressed that. In addition, there was a 12-page policy that's just on youth interrogations. My point is that there are lots of different subtle ways of interrogating individuals, which law enforcement professionals themselves find objectionable, that their training finds objectionable. And it may be one path forward to get down to the nitty-gritty of those details is to, as the legislature did with the model fair and impartial policing policy, which is also very, very detailed. That's not in statute, but it's a policy that departments have to follow. And that may be a surer path to get to some more of the details without trying to put it all in the legislation. Because there are many professionals, including like Vermont State Police, who would look at some of those prohibitions and say that Baltimore and also New Orleans has a similar set of policies since 2018 about youth interrogations. But they might say, yeah, that's not something we would do. We don't want law enforcement doing that. And you can put it in the policy, and then officers are accountable for the violating their policies. This law, it says it's prohibited, but that doesn't really say what the consequence to the officer is. And that's the current state of affairs. An officer can lie to someone. Maybe it gets excluded and maybe it doesn't. What's to stop the officer from doing it again? And the path that New Orleans and Baltimore have taken, other agencies are looking at that. As you put it in your policy as well, you violate policy. That's the problem. That's a matter for progressive discipline and additional training. So that's a path we think that, I think is worthy of consideration as well. All right, I'll stop there. Plenty more to say, but obviously your time is
We will have you back.
Thank you.
Try to schedule you first, not last.
It's next Tuesday, Tuesday?
I do wonder if the Criminal Justice Council has the capacity to do that kind of deep dive into policy. I've heard,
And enforcement.
yeah, and enforcement.
Well, I mean, they have, and I've just uploaded 2 policies